let me try and summarize it because there's been an evolution in both those people who identify as neocon and the way in which the label is applied. It began in the 1960s, and at that time it had a very specific sort of meaning. Today it has become vague and general and is used rather indiscriminately to characterize anyone who favors an aggressive American sort of foreign policy, uncompromising, downplays, denigrates sort of diplomacy, has an expansive vision of the U.S. and so forth. Now, some of these characteristics have become more generalized. I'll try and differentiate some of the main currents. I'm just making the point that without going into the history, in the 1960s, the neocons were people who were really rebelling against two things. And there were many leading intellectuals and people prominent in public life, but not in official positions. A number of them were academics. What they were rebelling against was two things. One was the cultural revolution of the 1960s, the counterculture. And that counterculture, of course, had aligned itself with a more radical political agenda, which had two parts. One was domestic and focused on continuing discrimination and suppression of blacks and minorities. That was the era of the civil rights movement as well. The other was in foreign policy. The countercultural people, broadly defined, were also staunchly in opposition to the war in Vietnam. Now, the people who self-styled themselves as neocons, and they themselves, I think, first coined that term. They were all liberals on domestic issues, and they certainly supported civil rights and the civil rights movement, but they were hardline anti-communists, and almost to a person, they supported the war in Vietnam. Over the course of the next couple of decades, the 70s and the 80s, this hardline foreign policy sort of position spread and permeated the ranks of the foreign policy community generally. It lost its liberal tinge or coloration, both regard to domestic issues, which faded into the background as far as the active foreign policy neocons were concerned, and linked up with the sort of hard nationalists, whatever you want to call them, the people, for example, who occupied high positions in the Reagan administration. Mm-hmm. So from that period on, the term neocon simply applied to anyone who subscribed to the famous, if not infamous, Wolfowitz Memorandum of March 1992. And that should be really the point of reference for anyone desirous of thinking through and finding whatever coherence, at least in a broad strategic sense, that American foreign policy thinking has. That was a seminal document. That was a document in Wolfowitz who was not really a neocon, but just a hawk in the traditional classic sense. He was then, I think, had a high position in the Defense Department, later became ambassador to Indonesia and head of the World Bank, but that's irrelevant to this issue. And it's a very stark statement of saying with the end of the Cold War, with the marginalization and weakening of the Soviet Union, the United States was in a position to shape a world order on a global scale according to its own dictates. that meant in terms of political principle and also in terms of the benefits of hegemony, whether they be tangible in an economic sense or whether they be intangible in terms of domination and being able to control the action on the international chessboard. Now, let me sort of jumping ahead. What has transpired over these 30 years is the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And it was formulated and promulgated as a memo, internal memo, which was leaked. And then President Bush, this was his last year in office, and his administration said, no, this is not official policy. It was a fascinating thing and rather intriguing because it really requires exposition and explanation, is that the basics of the Wolfowitz Doctrine now form the foundation for the extraordinary consensus in the American foreign policy community in support of a strategy which indeed does aim to reinforce American hegemony and to be very assertive and proactive in trying to undermine those emerging powers which might challenge it, namely China and the Soviet Union.
Russia.
Three things. So one more point, then we can jump into contemporary circumstances. There were three things which both hardened this position and made it the fallback, the default position, and by now really the committed position of 90% of the American foreign policy community, including officials and academics and think tank people, right, were three developments, one event and two developments. The great event was 9/11, which didn't have, you might say, a direct effect. You cannot draw a clear line of connection between it and the American reaction to it. On the one hand, its current attitudes, aggressive attitudes and hostile attitudes towards China and Russia. What it did do was to stir up a sense of American nationalism, touched with jingoism, chauvinism, whatever the appropriate term, as well as a free-floating feeling of anxiety. That is, it eroded the self-assurance and confidence that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States now had history on its side. There was a teleology at work in the world, and the United States was its agent. And that was challenged, in effect, by 9/11. And so this free-floating doubt as to whether indeed the United States, that was born in a condition of virtue, providentially dedicated to leading the world's people into an age of enlightenment, was valid and true. Second thing that happened was evolutionary, and that was Putin's reconstitution of Russia as a power. It's interesting that going back to that period, of the scene between Yeltsin and Putin, the United States was quite happy with Yeltsin because he was so weak and deferential, and Russia was disintegrating. Right? But even in the 90s, NATO expansion, which began under Bill Clinton, which implied a marginalization of Russia, constituted a pillar of American foreign policy. As Putin began to reconstitute Russia, and gradually it began to assume a sort of coherence of of a big state, if not a military competitor. In the decade of the 2000s, this concern about Russia and containing it increased. Right? That's what led to President Bush, the second Bush, the Jr.'s effort in 2008 to get the NATO Council to commit itself to inviting Ukraine to join NATO. And then that feeling became even more pronounced after the hostilities with Georgia, which followed thereafter. And that was used very effectively by the people who already held strongly anti-Russian attitudes and promoted the idea of really trying to keep Russia not just marginalized and contained, but weak. That energized them and gave them a talking point. Of course, the historical record, if it's correct, will show that it was the Georgians who initiated the attack on southern Ossetia, disputed territory, and the Russians reacted to it. It's not at all a question of Russian aggression. And it was the United States which backed them and urged them. On the day before the attack began, President, what was he, not Shavakashvili, similar name, called Rice, who was at that time, second most influential person in American foreign policy, and got to get final approval that you should go ahead with it. She said, yes, go ahead with it. My sources are briefly mentioned, not for historiographic purposes, but just to confirm that this is not something they pulled down from the heavens, is one, the deputy director of the OECD mission in Tiflis at the time, who knew what was going on. Two, a U.S. Army major, a personal acquaintance, who became a man of personal acquaintance, who helped train them and helped draw up the plan of attack. The third, if anyone wants to bother, is the then Georgian ambassador to Moscow, because in the height of the crisis, I think maybe a week afterwards, the parliament was called into session for a post-mortem, and they brought in on the line at a distance the ambassador to Moscow, and he didn't realize this conversation was discussions were being made public, and he made remarks which acknowledged exactly what had been plotted and planned and how it had been executed, and so they immediately cut the line. If there's any record of it, it'll be in Georgia. Anybody who knows Georgian can find it. China is a slower evolution, and of course, evolution in terms of American attitudes to China, all driven mainly by the extraordinary economic ascendancy of China, which has occurred, historic event, which has been dramatic, even a drama that's unfolded out over a number of years. That threat, which was initially seen mainly as commercial, took on larger dimensions over the course of the 2010s, the last decade, as China began to invest in the buildup of its military forces, and as, again, in an existential sense, Americans, and particularly American foreign policy thinkers, if that's an appropriate term, would apply to all of the current administration. But anyway, you realize, well, here's this huge country developing this enormous economic strength, building up a military. And what does this mean in terms of the American assumption that American hegemony would be the overriding fact of international life indefinitely, right? The transformation in thinking about China has occurred quite rapidly. For Trump, it was strictly economic, but Trump was only saw all international politics in transitional terms. What do you get? What do I get? He has no strategic sense whatsoever. Although most of the people in the administration took a more hostile view of China than he did, and this is acknowledged in the memoirs of some of those people. But even in the latter Obama years, in his second term, right, there was a growing sense that China was indeed a uniquely strategic threat. One still talked about a two-pronged approach. One, containment, which was understood both in military terms. That was the era when the U.S. went around trying to arrange, negotiate basing rights everywhere from Vietnam to Sri Lanka and so forth, but in a larger sense to contain it politically. And that became evident. Well, that was one prong. The other prong was cooperation. What does this mean? People hoped, many people, particularly those who were not really the hardest of the hawks, right, hoped, and these tended to be the liberal globalists, right, that China somehow could be assimilated into the neoliberal political economic order. Right? And so American policy for a number of years was following both paths. And then quite rapidly, suddenly, it's hard to put a date on it, right? I don't know, 5, 6 years. And here I'm talking about the foreign policy community generally, not just the Trump administration, which was so weird because Trump was out of it most of the time in terms of following any kind of coherent, consistent line. Happened very, very rapidly, and without any formal statement. Yes, there would be some articles appearing in Foreign Policy by people of some note, including ex-officials, who would say, well, China is too strong, too powerful, it's going to be too ambitious, and is already showing signs that it's not going to accept the United States as the rule setter and the rule enforcer of a neoliberal. Right? And that was dropped. That cooperation line was dropped. And we see it crystallize now in the hostility of the Biden administration, which is both a reflection and a reinforced stimulus and cause of the remarkably broad consensus now in the United States that China is indeed the ultimate threat, and we have to challenge it, and we have to challenge it, and to win a battle, in effect, for global supremacy. And everyone that Biden appointed was of this mind. And Biden himself was of this mind. And just a couple of words, and I'll turn it back over to you and move away from this monologue. Russia. Russia, of course, was underestimated and is to this day, even as the United States continued on this policy of enlargement and so forth. And you see it was Barack Obama who gave the green light to the 2014 coup. I mean, Victoria Nuland, went to Kiev and handed out cookies. And most of the people she handed out cookies to were the hard men, the neo-fascists, and by the way, those are the people the United States had already begun working with in terms of military training. Why and how, I don't know. It is known. But the cookie she brought might as well have been baked by Michelle Obama, because this was an Obama thing. Victoria Nuland was, although extraordinary, assertive person, as an assistant secretary, can't get on a plane, go to Kiev, and help to organize a coup. Right? But still, there was both this assumption that we could and should isolate Russia, and at the same time believe that Russia was not as much of a threat as China. And in this context, there was the hope, proven to be, it should have been anticipated, that this was a fool's errand. And a fool's errand being an effort to split off Russia from China. In its later, more recent variation over the last 2 years, really the Biden relation and the Ukraine crisis, was that you kind of knock off Russia via the instrument of Ukraine war, which would humiliate Russia and would force regime change in Moscow. People truly believed it. And people like our Secretary of State believed it, and our president believed it. And some of them still believe it at high levels of the foreign policy community. So in a way, you push Russia aside, and then you could concentrate all of your efforts on China. And that resonates today because the so-called realists, who some of them anonymous, who beginning to publish pieces like in Foreign Affairs, right, the flagship journal of the American foreign policy community, Council on Foreign Relations, saying we should find an off-ramp in Ukraine because it's siphoning off too much diplomatic energy, resources, military assets, which should be reserved for the forthcoming showdown with China. And you have people like the designated new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his predecessor, both testifying in public before senatorial committees, confirmation committees, that they anticipate a war with China by the latest, the end of the decade. And the Pentagon, the U.S. military, with the backing of the American public, should do everything it could to prepare for this Armageddon. That's where we are. So all in terms of the term neocon, all of these people in effect are adherents to the Wolfowitz doctrine, and they are neocon. The one ellipse or sidebar we should add is that some of the original neocon thinking survived and then was recreated at the time of the 1990s Yugoslav and Rwanda crises by liberal-minded globalists who came up with the idea of right to protect, interventionism on a humanitarian basis. And these people are personified by our former ambassador to United Nations, Ms. Powers, and others. And that rather quickly lost its humanistic edge and simply added an American idealistic strand or coloration to this sort of broad consensus, right, of being assertive, aggressive, and setting as the imperative, not just a priority of American foreign policy, maintaining and expanding American hegemony and putting down those who might rival it. Long-winded, that's I think in a nutshell is where we are and how we got here. The United States does that now. Of course, it always has in some way. I mean, the United States has always used this idealistic, language. But if you could say, let's say, the 1990s, you had, let's say, the Wolfowitz people, right? You had developing the neoliberals who wanted to see a global peace brought about, but a Kantian peace by integrating the world economically, and they being reinforced by the right to intervene people over the course of the 1990s. So you had like three, two and a half, if you like, right? Now they've all merged. And there's some differences insofar as there's some people who still rhetorically use idealistic language and retain in their own minds a belief in benign American potential, right? And ideal, and with the indispensable nation, that's not because we're the only one who could resolve matters, but because we're also the bearer of public goods that will benefit everybody. Some of that lived on with it, and some of it is still used rhetorically, and some of the old timers, like Joseph Nye at Harvard, who I greatly respect and know him. He's a supporter, and he was, very liberal, idealistic, neoliberal, globalist, humanitarian concerns, very intelligent. All that. He is a supporter of everything the United States is doing in Ukraine, and wrote a small piece wrote something saying that he's been impressed and reassured by how deftly Biden has handled the Ukraine affair. So it's, I don't want to put down Joe Nye, who's a prince of a man. He's now, I think, around 86, whatever. But this is a demonstration as to how complete the American foreign policy community has been, I don't know what you want, taken over or has accepted what is essentially, a Wolfowitz view of American strategic purpose and operation in the world. Some saying, well, a little more diplomacy. Some saying, like the old Cold War days, pure military might, drop one in the men's room of the Kremlin, 1960s. But leaving that aside, looking at the underlying foundation, it's the same. It leads to the same definition of national interest, the same threat perception, more or less, pretty much now, and the same readiness for the U.S. to do what it is doing in regard to Russia and China and Iran and anybody else who gets in our way. We've gone so far as to help to encourage the coup in Pakistan against Imran Khan, but buying off and promising things to the military and so on. We now feel a need to poke our nose into just about everything to an extent which matches, if it does not surpass, what we did at the height of the Cold War. We supported the coup in Bolivia by these, I don't know what, combination conquistador, neo-fascist sort of, Franco admirers. What's the U.S. interest? Well, maybe some commercial interest in natural resources in the Amazon and copper and so forth. But this is part of the mindset, and also a better term maybe is the emotion set, because this is all driven by extraordinarily powerful feelings. And one last one. These sentiments and attitudes are most strongly held among the United States' political class, and especially among the foreign policy community. Public opinion in general is not as enthusiastic about these things. They have much less emotion invested. The emotional investment that went into, or that was generated by 9/11 and the war on terror, does not exist insofar as Russia and China are concerned. So this is really an elite-driven phenomenon. And you could say that, well, you can say the same thing in Europe, Western Europe, is that, Western societies have been betrayed by the elites. Now, I would say in other matters too, but that's irrelevant here because I'm a social democrat. The United States, from the outset, which means the late 1940s, early 50s, saw these organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, and then GATS, which is the antecedent of the World Trade Organization, as means to do two things. Both to create a congenial and ideologically, philosophically congenial international system, which they generally thought, if all of its ends were achieved and communism disappeared, would provide the basis for integration, harmony, peace, etc. At the same time, they were useful in terms of promoting American interests. In the early days, the two were seen as convergent. The United States was seen, it always kept a sharp eye out for its own interests, while at the same time generating and certainly believing it was generating public goods. And over time, which is a long time now, I mean, it's seven decades, the public goods dimension has faded operationally, functionally, and the special interest benefit element has risen in the thinking and calculations and policies and behavior of the United States. And it has indeed used the IMF and the World Bank to promote the American hegemonic view of the shape that the world should take. And in fact, both organizations implicitly and in some cases explicitly apply political criteria in a starker fashion than they did during the Cold War. Because the Cold War was felt, well, if you could just keep a country stable and growing economically, this would prevent it from going communist. Now it's used to promote a more drastic version of market fundamentalism economically, right? And two, it is used, these two organizations under American influence are used to affect internal political outcomes in many places. One of the things the United States did was to use the IMF to threaten, to in effect send the message to the generals in Rawalpindi that if they didn't get rid of Imran Khan, then the desperately needed IMF loan might be delayed further, might not even be forthcoming. That's the extent to which the United States now has, in effect, if you look at it, what I believe is objective, on an objective basis, has pulled aside the veil and is now behaving like any classic realpolitik power, using all instruments of influence at its disposal to control more and more of world affairs and the conduct of states, of other states. That I think is the sad reality. The interesting is it's never been so stated. And only the uber hawks, include some of the people we call neocons, like Victoria Nuland, would say and write that explicitly. But there has never been any general debate, certainly not at the political level, that the United States, and to be more concrete, should in effect announce total war on China, which is what we're doing and have done.
And the amazing
no debate about it whatsoever at the political level, and very little at the think tank level. They just sort of totally crystallized and taken as given, as if sort of decreed from high authority, although it wasn't decreed from high authority as such. I mean, Americans, for example, are totally unaware that not a single country outside of the collective West has agreed to imposition of the sanctions regime on Russia. It simply does not appear. The New York Times, supposedly the newspaper of record, which has enormous radiating influence in various ways, is never mentioned. It's become a propaganda sheet of a more or less sophisticated, at least in terms of language and less articles, for this now mainstream view, or everything that it has supported, every single thing the Biden administration has done and says that it intends to do. It hasn't even questioned this implicit proclamation of total war against China. I said, to get to the answer of this, we really don't have the time to do it now. I really think, and I've written a few things about this, you've really got to plumb the American psyche, the depths of the American political culture, a bit of combination of anthropology and abnormal psychology. Some normal, some abnormal psychology to understand it. And just like one remark on this is that we have to understand that Americans indeed are all born with a sense of singularity, exceptionality, and superiority. For many, it's sort of a providential element. Others, it's just there. This is history, the reality of things. In other words, the United States being number one, of course, in terms of world influence, it wasn't number one or close to it till after World War I. But if you look back, I mean, there's a lot of muscle flexing, even throughout the 19th century. Manifest destiny meant not only liquidating the indigenous population, the Indians, which he did ruthlessly, and very quickly, very, very quickly in terms of number of years. But we initiated a war conquest against Mexico on purely specious grounds in 1848. And we took a vast territory, half of the Mexico of 1848. We picked a fight with Spain in 1898 on no central grounds either, and picked off. Now, in both cases, there was domestic opposition, right? It became popular when you won, and it was, the yellow journalism and the press played up these things, and Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. But in neither the Mexican case nor the Spanish case was there's any great pressure to do it.
And
And
don't
and it was not even unanimous among you know who was one of the most articulate opponents of the Mexican War and who spoke about it in Congress was Abraham Lincoln. Two other instances of elite betrayal, if you like.
mm,
But there was certainly more criticism and opposition, certainly in the lead up to those two escapades, than there is now. Now, remember, there was also a lot of opposition to the invasion of Iraq, despite the post 9/11 hysteria.
yeah.
People did not buy the idea that Iraq is an onward place to go to get at Al Qaeda. And the same thing in Western Europe, mass demonstrations in the streets.
Yeah.
But
But
as soon as the bombs fell on what, March 11th or March 10th of 2003, the opposition dissolved. And some of it reemerged, you know, with the torture and arrests and the whole failure of it. What's interesting with the Ukraine affair and, you know, this de facto declaration of war on China is there's no opposition. Anyway, again, you know, I think we're in the realm of collective psychology. But let me
mm-hmm,
just very briefly tick off a couple of points. First, the difference with Vietnam is we don't have a conscript army.
mm-hmm,
It's an all-volunteer army,
mm-hmm,
small. So it doesn't resonate the way Vietnam did.
mm,
Second, most of our wars since Vietnam have been sort of video game wars. Even 1991, large forces engaged, total American casualties were 300, and 250 of them were because of a Iraqi missile that luckily landed in the middle of the dining hall of a National Guard in Saudi Arabia. So they've been, you know, they said, you know, like computer game wars, right? Second, I think thing to keep in mind is that Americans have become politically very passive, except on certain kinds of cultural domestic issues. And here again, it's odd because they're not economic issues. People are not mobilized despite the extraordinary inequality, the way in which the United States, in one sense, we're truly become a plutocracy, which permeates every layer of government. There is no, in fact, the Democratic Party doesn't even make an issue of it because the Democratic Party has gone the way of all the, they've been bought out, lock, stock, and barrel. So there's a certain passivity, right? Three, Americans have become, you know, everybody uses these terms, but their full import, I think, is not recognized to be, you know, narcissistic, self-absorbed, careerist. And this is both the spawn of a nihilistic, in my view, society, and creates a nihilistic society being one in which any kind of constraint on individual behavior, any kind of norm of behavior, is seen as something you adhere to only a matter of convenience, which means there's no sense of community, of collectivity. And that then means that everybody is pursuing, even if it's them, and downplaying and ignoring collective needs and interests, including what the United States does foreign policy. And in this regard, a final point there is something that is uniquely American, and that is the extent to which, and this is a hypothesis of mine, I just discussed with many friends and people, but anyway, the hypothesis is that Americans, to a greater extent than most other peoples, are such that their individual self-esteem is derivative of a sense of the singularity of the United States as a country.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent to which the United States' singularity is challenged, being under threat, this is also a threat to their individual self-esteem. Now, that is a proposition very hard to operationalize through, but there are all these currents, in the political subconscious of the country, which I think, a person of discernment living here senses at least the manifestations of, if not, the deep sources. That generation who are now no longer on the scene. Well, one, they were imbued with a different ethic and ethos about public service. Second, they had more latitude to express themselves and to exert themselves. And their views were given greater credit when they're in the diplomatic service than the contemporary counterparts are now. Fourth, American diplomatic service has always been crimped because most of the major appointments are not from the diplomatic service, but political beneficiaries of whoever is president, whatever parties in power. But in terms of sources of advice, of intellectual formulation of guidance, right? The American diplomatic corps has been eclipsed by the core of sort of think tank, ambitious sort of think tank, so-called strategists. And of course, there's a lot of in and out between the think tank world and the, and government. But most of the think tankers today, unlike 40 years ago, believe it or not, actually, was involved with them 40 years ago, all aim at power positions in government and appointments. When Barack Obama became president, half of the Brookings Institution joined. And to follow it on the think tanks in the United States, almost down to the last one of any consequence anyway, are no longer independent. They are owned by the people who keep them financially afloat. And those are large corporations, mainly but not exclusively in the financial sector, and two maverick billionaires like the Koch brothers, who've totally taken over things like the Cato Institute. And they're doing the same at universities as well, where they're taking over programs and centers through donations that come with strings attached, and the universities don't have the integrity to reject it. They've taken over the law schools in a number of places. And here and some of the universities who've accepted this are names you will recognize, like Yale. Yale created a new school with an associated sort of institute, I forget what they call it, something like diplomacy, with money, exclusively with money donated by two old-time Wall Street predators. And these two guys have also used them as leverage to influence, and this became a scandal over the past year. They got rid of, they forced out the dean as being too liberal and dovish. They and now are insisting in changes in curriculum. That's it. Similar things at Harvard. And so there, of course, you're touching on not just the way in which the American foreign policy community has the directions it's taken, or the American political classes, adherence to a facile consensus on the things we've been talking about. But you're talking about the deterioration of American political culture, institutional culture, generally. Because what's happening and has happened in Washington, you talk about, the best Congress money can buy, which is absolutely true. Same thing is happening in the universities and higher education and the foundation world. It's a generalized phenomenon, and that's when you combine that with this sort of self-centered careerism, then there's going to be no Jack Matlocks, there's going to be no Chas Freemans, and they're certainly not going to exercise any influence if by some stroke of luck and good fortune, people like that were going to appear and survive. American diplomats, contemporary Democrats, frankly, for the most part, are pretty mediocre-like. I mean, some are diligent, hardworking, conscientious, etc. I don't mean to demean them as such, but people of real talent and independence and brains, it can't think of one. I can't think of one. As of this anti-Russian, anti-Putin hysteria, there's many sources, and it's still hard to pin down. But I mean, it's obviously totally irrational, and tells you how far thinking among this elite, well-educated American foreign policy community has gone off the rails. I mean, because I mean, the conception they have and propagate about both Russia and Putin, the discrepancy between it and reality doesn't mean you have to approve everything that Russia or Putin does, but the gap between the reality, whatever they're shading, and these kinds of cartoon images is enormous. Enormous. I mean, you're using cartoon images even in journals and papers and media of what used to be some distinction, which I think they're completely lost, right?
I mean,
which come go back to World War II. I mean, Hillary Clinton herself declared that Putin was the new Hitler. It's a direct quote. I mean, this is mad. It's a classic dominant-subordinate relationship. I mean, you can take this out of a psychology textbook. That it has lasted so long, though, and among people who have also the gravest of responsibilities for the welfare of the society, and have seen the United States lead them over the cliff with regard to the 2008 financial crisis. So those American ideas, American banking practices, that spread with the cord, that led them over the cliff in Iraq, which led to accentuation of terrorist acts, as well as was the reason why in 2015 Europe got inundated with masses of migrants, right? And the effects that has had on European polities and the rise of the far right. So despite all, and now the United States has led them over the cliff into the Ukraine disaster, in a way. And now the United States is leading them over the cliff into a total confrontation with China. And nobody speaks up. Here we're really in the world of psychopathology, which is the European counterpart to American psychopathology. I mean, I hate to be so negative, but it's hard to avoid these conclusions. And the caliber of political leadership is so poor, it's almost impossible to imagine anybody coming forward to resist it.